I took all the questions and I just reflected on it, and I boiled it down to 3 slides. The first one is about attitude. The second one, I was going to talk about the legal framework a little bit, and the third one was on change. So it might be a little mixed up and I might not be answering all the questions. Right, so on the whole question about attitude, I think the answering all those first few questions that were put to us, torture is denounced by the executive and also by the legislature as an acceptable form of crime control, even though the practice is otherwise. So actually at the executive level as well as at the legislative level, it's denounced, it's looked down on, even though we find that the practice is otherwise. And the reason I'm talking about attitude here is because the question is very complex. So as a moral concept, right, torture and ill treatment are basically considered morally repugnant. You can get on to the first slide, thanks. Yeah. Now, however, right, the issue is Sri Lanka, as you know, has gone through a conflict, and we have had long periods of emergency rule. We have had to combat terrorism, right? And the general public have come to, in a sense, accept certain levels of violence, certain levels of torture under those circumstances. So if you talk to people, right, you can see that there is an attitudinal shift. So if you say, zero tolerance for torture, it's really not what the average person has in their mind anymore. So there is a certain level of acceptance there, and how do you actually change that? The other thing is law enforcement authorities, right, are driven by the fact that they have to solve crimes, and they are under pressure, constant pressure. So to them, having the box ticked that there's so many crimes, so many solved, is important to them. So the means is very secondary. Actually the end is what's important, the means become secondary. So I think the public also has the same view in a sense. You see, you have to get rid of the problem, right? It doesn't matter how you actually get rid of the problem. So I think we have a whole attitudinal issue, and how do we actually address this attitudinal issue? If you look at the second slide, if you look at the legal framework, right, now Sri Lanka has ratified virtually all the important conventions, right, and in addition to that, if you look at the constitutionally also, there are constitutional prohibitions, right, against torture, cruel and degrading treatment, right, and there is basic legal protection in connection with arrest, initial detention, interrogation, extended detention, and so forth. So there is a reasonable legal framework in place, and we have basically taken the convention and actually incorporated it in our law, right, the CAT Act of 1994, to give effect to it. But it doesn't have 2 important things in our local law, which is in the convention, right? The act doesn't establish the universal jurisdiction for acts of torture. Now, what that means is, if you are committed the crime of torture in Sri Lanka, a British court can basically try me in a British court. Now, that's not unusual. Lots of countries actually don't concede that universal jurisdiction. So I'm just pointing out that that is a gap, if you want, between the convention and our local law. The other thing that it doesn't have is it makes no reference to the principle of non-refoulement, right, in our local law. And what that means is, right, for example, if you take refugees as an example, Sri Lanka is a refugee sending country, and Sri Lanka is now a refugee accepting country. And I don't think we ever thought of us as going to be a refugee accepting country. So as a refugee sending country, right, if you get on a boat and you go off to Australia, and the Australian government gets hold of you and deports you back to Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka hasn't committed an offense. Australia may have committed an offense depending on their law, right? Because they may be sending somebody back to a jurisdiction where they may face torture, you see, in that situation. So the reason I put this as a gap is now we are in a different situation where there are refugees coming into Sri Lanka from Pakistan, right? And these are refugees who are coming because of the lack of religious freedom or torture for religion, who are coming into Sri Lanka. And we have a few thousand now. And suddenly you have a situation that the Sri Lankan government, after a few years has decided that we are just going to repatriate them back. So we are actually sending them back to, arresting them, putting them on planes, and we are sending them back to Pakistan, right? So they may be going back, going back to a situation which they fled from, which they thought that they will be tortured because of their religious beliefs or whatever. Now we are sending them back to a situation in which they think that they may face violence or torture. And that's because the law doesn't protect them, you see. And therefore I see that also as now an important gap in our law, because normally when a refugee comes, the UNHCR process has to take place, and then they are either legitimized and a country of settlement is found, or they are asked to basically go back to their country. Now we are short-circuiting that by saying we can't wait for that process, we are just going to put you on a plane and send you back. So I thought maybe that's worthwhile mentioning that as a gap in our law. The evidence ordinance is designed to act as a deterrent in effecting custodial torture in obtaining confessions. In other words, confessions obtained under certain conditions, right, may not be admissible in court. Get on to my final slide. Right, I've just put a whole lot of bullet points there, and maybe I can probably just talk about one or two of them. Clearly training of the law enforcement authorities, we've discussed that before. Allocation of resources from the national budget, maybe as Basil pointed out, it's timely for us because we have a budget just coming up in 2 weeks from now, and certainly we'll pay attention and maybe take up the arguments in that debate. On the criminal justice system, right, now we have a system which is obviously very corrupt. So getting a judicial medical officer's report, if you are tortured, you have to go to a judicial medical officer, you have to get a report, and that's going to be extremely hard if the torturer is a law enforcement authority person. In fact, the judicial officer may not give you the report, right? And if you were to obtain the report, it could be rare, and it could mean that you would yourself have to succumb to corruption to actually obtain the report, which in itself may be the correct report. Then you have the issue of, again, the system being corrupt in that you have the magistrates and so forth. There's an important thing in our prisons ordinance, that is that the magistrates have to visit the prisons, right? It's in the prisons ordinance. It's a part of the, part of the law. But the other day I was talking to a magistrate, and I said that, you all never really observe this. Why aren't you going and looking at the conditions under which prisoners are being held, right? I mean, it may be people who have been just arrested and they are pending the court process. And the person said, I can't do that because if I were to actually go there, I'm the person who is actually sending them there, that may not be a very safe option for me to actually go there and to review it. Then I asked somebody else and found out that there was now a lot of new appointments, and the new appointments were actually ladies, females who had been appointed, and they felt that the prisons were not even a place that a female magistrate could actually visit, you see, and that's why they were actually not going there. So it's a very complicated problem. Now, members of parliament are also provided by law, actually, the privilege of visiting the prisons. Now, how members of parliament actually abuse it is that if somebody we know is arrested, right, then we go there actually to visit that particular prisoner or the particular person who has been arrested. But actually the intention of the law is not that. The intention of the law is that we have been given that privilege so that we go to look at how the judicial system actually functions. That's really the intention of the law. So on the 1st of October, a few days ago, I, along with some of the members of parliament, 4 others from the party I represent, we went to, we have 3 main prisons and we have about another 14 prisons. We actually went to prison on the 1st of October. And that's the first time I think it has ever been done that members of parliament have gone, you know, in an organized basis. About a month earlier, I wrote to the officials saying that I was coming to the prisons with a delegation of members of parliament. And immediately I got a reaction saying, please don't come because, you know, we have a very important movement of prisoners on that particular day from one prison to the other. Now, we've been doing it by going to other government institutions, and we have never taken no for an answer. We have always, I have stuck to the date. I've always gone on that particular date. And in the first instance I did that, that was in April this last year. Man appeared with a pistol, basically, and gave us chase. And because the media was there, and I go with the media, that was on the national media instantly. And, you know, it just went through the country, and the country was shocked that a incident like that happened. I actually thought at that moment that it was a hired assassin, but it turned out later to become the mayor of the city of Hambantota, which is the city from which the president actually comes. So I said that to you just to show you what you are up against. And the only time we backed down from going on the date was into the prison, because when we enter the prison, we can't actually take our government-provided protection officers, and the prison administration takes over our security. So obviously it crossed my mind that they might actually instigate the prisoners to set upon us, and therefore it was wise actually to not go in. So I basically responded back and said, certainly you have very important movement of prisoners that we will not be coming, but I will be coming in the future. And that's what we did on the 1st of October. We went back in there. So when we went in there, I'm saying this as a practical case. All of it may not be relevant to the specific questions asked. What did I actually see there? One thing I saw there was that was a prison which was 139 years old, right? And the physical plant was in very poor condition. And when the budget is done, the budget still focuses on the recurrent expenditure, and there's very little capex that's provided for the physical plant. In fact, when I asked the prisons commissioner who was there, he didn't even know what the capex was. And then you could see, you know, the buildings were falling apart, the toilets were absolutely unacceptable, and the floors were wet, and the conditions in which the prisoners were held were extremely poor. Then I went into, with my 4 colleagues, I went into the high security zone, which actually held those who had been condemned to death, and who had also been convicted for life imprisonment. Now those cells were built for one person to be held in that very small area. They're let out for half an hour into the open in the day, then they're brought in and locked in, and then the cells are there, but they could walk on the corridor, the common corridor, and then at 5 o'clock they're all banged in again, and they're locked in again till morning. I was told that there were between 5 to 7 people held in a cell, but at the point I went, right, there were only 3 to 4 people in a cell, and we were able to actually talk to them and just to find out. So one of the issues was that it was to do with the physical condition, the physical related issues. The other issues were there to do with social issues, because when people are brought into the prisons, right, some will be 20 years old and others will be 50 years old, 40, 50 years old, hardened criminals. Some would be just amateur, if I can use that word, who have been caught. Ultimately, once they have been convicted, they're all mixed and put together. So an amateur becomes a hardened criminal once they are in the process. So what it really lacks is a grading of prisoners, and actually the prison officials told us that they actually grade the prisoner according to the nature of the crime and so forth, but they can't actually implement a segregated way of doing it. Like for example, if you go into hospital, this was the example used, you have a ward, so your tuberculosis patients will be on one side, your diabetes patients on one side, your surgery people in another ward, and there is some kind of ward specialization, which is what actually should be happening in the prison, but they can't actually do it for the lack of resources. That was what they were saying, and therefore they, as again, say, have to lump everybody together. Now, when they do that, these social issues come up, and among the social issues is also sexual exploitation within the prison. And what took me by surprise was, and I have no scientific basis for saying this, so don't jump at me. I was told that this was a bigger problem, and I have no explanation at all. I'm just repeating what was said. Among women than among men within the prison, the sexual exploitation was greater. I think that's something that probably needs to be looked at a little bit more deeply, to see whether it's a particularly Sri Lankan issue or whether that issue is prevalent in other countries. So lesbianism is apparently very rampant. Again, no evidence, because I asked them for the evidence and they told me they know it's all there. They turned a blind eye. The only time they act when a complaint is made. When a complaint is made, and they said that's very rare, then they act, because they have a disciplinary process and a separation of prisoners and individuals at that point in time. So physical issues, social issues, and then there are the judicial issues. Now the judicial issues, it didn't surprise me, but the magnitude of it was, now these are convicted people I was talking to. Now they are on appeal. So they are held in Mahara on that basis. And once the appeal is heard and they are convicted, then they are taken either to Colombo or they are taken to Bogambara in Kandy and held there, because if they are death row prisoners, and the reason they are held there is because those are the two prisons which have gallows, so that you could be hung. Even though I might quickly add that the law provides for it, Sri Lanka has not. Right, basically put to death any prisoner for since 1977 or something like that, because we don't actually in practice do it, even though the law provides for it. But technically they had to be transferred there, because that's where the sentence could be actually carried out. Now they have been waiting for their appeal to be heard on average, right? And I talked to I think nearly 70 odd people who are held there, for 5 to 7 years. So the case comes up and it's put for a forward date 6 months at a time. So 6 months at a time, it keeps going, 5 to 7 years. And I spoke to one prisoner who had been there for 11 years. And the case has still not been taken up. So clear case of justice delayed, justice denied. So those are some of the issues. Corruption was a big issue. Drug addiction was a big issue. They were linked, and the prison officials were finding it very difficult to cope up with that problem. And they admitted that there are a few officers who are involved in it, but that's a problem. Right, so coming to another point, this point about the security of the state versus the security of the people. Clearly our system doesn't think about the security of the people. I think we had this conversation over lunch as well. It's very clear it's not even the security of the state, but the security of those who are currently in power. Right? The police is an extension of that. So security is defined more as, in terms of external attack rather than in terms of rights. People, law enforcement authorities don't think about it in terms of they're there to protect people's rights. Then when we talk about reform of the police, we are often asking the police to reform itself. Reports are written, seminars are held, right? Representation is made, and you go. And actually we are asking the police to reform itself. It's as bad as asking parliamentarians to reform themselves. It's as bad as that. The system works for us, right? So the system works for the policeman as well, I think, right? So why would they want to reform? Why would they want change, you see? So that is why I think that we have to build pressure from the bottom in some way, people's pressure, otherwise it will not reform. The whole issue of, we talked about democracy and then democracy in political parties, the system works for the people who are there. So often you can't change it because you can't really, unless you have, people putting the pressure from the bottom. And people really underestimate the power they have because they don't know how sensitive politicians are if they know that people are really organized and going to use that power. Right? So they don't know that. I would say that we can't leave police reforms to the police. One striking thing, and I think Basil alluded to this a few minutes ago, a very interesting thing, is I was driving along the road, I think it was in Sydney or in Melbourne, and I saw this sign on the road which said, security camera ahead. So the sign is telling me that they are going to take a picture of me ahead, and if I break the law, I'm going to be charged for it. Right? So it's telling me the presence is there. And it's reminding me that I have to be mindful of the law. On the contrary, just close to where I live and where I have my political office, there is a little one-way turn. And I, of course, never go down the wrong side of the road. I take the long road and come round. But every day, people just take that little short one way. And the policeman actually hides inside a bush there. Every day, the policeman hides there. And then the moment somebody breaches the law, they come running out, signals them, and they call them into the bush, and then they probably collect a bribe. So we were talking about reform, and we're talking about attitude and how things happen. In the other situation, it was presence. In this situation, it's absence of presence, right? And in that situation, you want people to keep the law and not get caught to the law. In this situation, you want them to get caught to the law, right? Because of the economic benefit. So how do you actually change this paradigm, and how do you change the, thinking? So, I just put those two last points, and they're very generic points, educating, not the police, I really put the word, that's okay. I put the word there, educating the politician and educating the public, right? So the first one would be educate the politician, then we need to educate the public. Because the police, I think it's more to do with the training. Because I think the politician needs to be aware of the issue. I would have said one-day seminar on this kind of issue, even with the Sri Lankan parliamentarians, right, I think would be a very useful way. And we could handle it initially in a very non-threatening way, because if they are informed, then we can move them from being informed to the next step. I think I would start by educating the politician rather than the public, because I think that when you need to do change, you need to have some critical number of people who are aware of the change that you want to make. Thank you.
And I'm interested to hear whether the law doesn't provide for prosecution of perpetrators, of foreign perpetrators of torture who are in Sri Lankan jurisdiction, or if the law doesn't recognize, if the UK chose, for example, to prosecute a perpetrator who was on UK soil, whether the Sri Lankan government or authorities wouldn't recognize that judgment, because it's really up to UK's jurisdiction. For example, in the case of the Nepali general who was recently arrested, it was because their legislation provided for universal jurisdiction. My second question is on the evidence ordinance and whether or not that provides a procedure through which it can be determined whether or not a confession or a piece of evidence was obtained through torture. Because as I mentioned at lunch today, I do a lot of work on Tunisia, and there's several pieces of legislation in the constitution and also in the law, the Criminal Procedure Code, that prohibits the use of evidence obtained through torture, but there's actually no practical way by which a judge can actually determine the veracity of a claim that a confession was obtained through torture. So in some jurisdictions, a judge can halt the proceedings and then open a separate proceeding under a different judge to determine whether or not the claim is valid. And then if it's determined that it was, then the original charge is thrown out and other evidence has to be brought. So I'd just be interested to hear what the situation is in Sri Lanka. On the sexual exploitation, is that in prisons? I'm curious, is that between wardens and inmates, or among inmates, or among inmates? Okay. And then the last thing you mentioned, last question of mine, is you mentioned corruption as a big issue in the prisons, and I'd be really interested if you could maybe elaborate on that a little bit, because I think this is obviously a big issue. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah. On the corruption issue, a disproportionate number of inmates we found were there because of drug-related offenses. Now, the number of we call them kind of entrepreneurs, we call them mudalalis. It's a Sinhala word for like big businessmen who have actually been nabbed and are held in the prisons is very few. Actually, there was only one, because I specifically asked who was here, sort of thing. There was only one. Because the nexus between politics and this is fairly close. We have had a recent debate in Parliament on that, and there was a debate in which the Prime Minister, Secretary, had actually issued a letter asking for 2 containers of goods to be released by the customs, and it was found out that those 2 containers actually contained drugs. And the whole of drugs that have been recently actually taken into custody have been huge. These are hundreds of kilograms, so these are not small numbers. It's raised the question whether Sri Lanka is actually becoming a trading center. It's raised that question. The leader of the opposition also raised the question recently as to, we would like to know how, when these things are taken into custody, they are actually being disposed of. I'm talking to you about issues which are now very much in the public domain, and information could be got. The parliamentary records are there, the Hansards are there on it. So it's a big issue. And when you went into the prison, you realize by the number of people in there. But unfortunately, the people who are in there are more the consumer and the small pusher at the retail level. That's actually the person who is the law has actually caught up with. There is, there is some stories, shall I call it stories, that the trade continues sometimes when some of those people are inside, right? And all they need is a communications method. And then I really don't know, about the consumption levels within, right? But it's there. And smuggling goes on. And I will be too embarrassed to explain how that smuggling happens, including mobile phones are smuggled. And I was told by the prison officials that sometimes up to 3 phones have been found. And it's even more embarrassing because it's not men only, it's women also, right? And then officials told me that they were also embarrassed by the fact that they had to inspect. And their inspection had to be physical because they didn't have the machines to actually do electronic inspection. So that's one thing we promised, is to take that up in the debate and actually ask for an allocation so that electronic machines could be used. And then they were, I must say I was impressed by the higher prison officials. They said that if somebody objected to that inspection, that they won't press with it because they would think it would be a violation of somebody's rights. And therefore, but if they are still convinced that this person has the goods, as if it were, they would hospitalize the person within the prisons. And then they will give them, some medical treatment so that you can't actually keep anything within yourselves for too long. So they were handling it in a different way. So I was quite impressed actually, because you had to, under the circumstances of having limited resources, you had to be ingenious in actually dealing with the problem, at the same time trying to protect the right of the prisoner. So I thought that was interesting. Coming to your final thing, which you were asking me on the first question you asked on the legal issues, I will just make a very brief comment and actually let Basil answer that, because he'll be far more equipped to answer that than myself, is that once a law was passed in 1994, there were a number of cases that were brought to the courts. There were convictions, if I remember, about 6 cases, there were sentences given, and then suddenly the whole thing collapsed after that. In terms of torture. But I'll let Basil answer the specifics of the question you actually asked.
The question of universal jurisdiction not being included in the our law merely means that we cannot prosecute somebody in who comes to our jurisdiction, but it cannot exclude the jurisdiction of another country if a Sri Lankan a person who was tortured is found there, because that's their law. If their law gives them universal jurisdiction, well, we are part of it. We cannot prevent ourselves being, for example, Nepali situation. If it is a Sri Lankan who was caught in Geneva, in United States or in England, then they can prosecute us. So that's direct, from a legal point of view, that is the situation. The question of non-refoulement is even more a difficult question, because now in Hong Kong is not a signatory to the Refugee Convention, but certain lawyers went to the Court of Appeal on some cases, and actually the first case was a Sri Lankan case where a person claimed that he has been tortured in Sri Lanka, and therefore he is afraid to go back because he will be tortured again. Now the court held now it has become the guiding principle that although we are not signatory to the Refugee Convention, since we are party to the CAT Convention, we cannot send a person, if he is afraid that he will be subjected to the. So I think in strictly speaking, the same situation will apply to Sri Lanka, because we are signatories to the convention, and not only that, we have even made this law. So that doesn't depend on this law. That depends on our signing the CAT convention. So on the basis of the convention, that we cannot send somebody who fears that he will be actually subjected to torture or his life will be in danger. So that may be a question that may come up in the recent cases, on Pakistani refugees, particularly Ahmadiyas, very highly persecuted section in this thing. May I also add one more question to what you have said? See, now in terms of drugs, now it's a more or less some kind of a common perception that whether we are becoming a center, Now that question is associated to the overall question we are discussing here. If the criminal justice system collapses, we can be not only a center for this crime, for any other crime, the money laundering. So there is a other side, other way of arguing for all the things that we are talking about. From that point of view, arguing it negatively, from a negative point of view, that if you let this system collapse, because only a criminal justice system can prevent a proper prevention of drugs we use. And now if that system fails, anything can happen. So what we are facing in Sri Lanka, I think that is the point of view from which a politician can take up the issue, is a highly vulnerable situation to very many forms of dangers to society, because the criminal justice system has failed. So anything can happen. So ultimately, even on a security issue, the military cannot prevent many of the things that can be really dangerous to Sri Lanka, because it is the day-to-day criminal surveillance is done by the criminal justice system. So there is a danger to the very existence of the Sri Lankan system in terms of the criminal justice failure. Now, if you take from that point of view, then there is an answer to the main question that you have been raising. People say, let's work with whatever that works. How do they come to that conclusion? If everything has failed, then at least a minimum that can be done, you do whatever way. So even that is a confirmation that people no longer think these systems work. So there is a public perception, things have failed. Now we don't want to die because things have failed. So you do some way or the other, we are not going to complain about it, because there is no point complaining now. So the level of frustration in the people on this issue of criminal justice failure is a fundamental political problem. If the opposition is clever, the opposition should exploit. We know from the campaigning for about 20 years on the issue of torture, how much of reception there is when you go to talk about this. At the beginning, people feel indifferent because people have talked but nothing happens. But then when they see this is a more genuine way of this thing, people open up. So there is the internal insecurity in the country of the average citizen. The woman, the child, all these people are of an acute problem. Now, if the opposition exploit this aspect with the view, promising that if we are in power, we will do following thing. Of course, you have to show that you really know the subject, and that your remedies will be like this. That will attract, I think, very large in favor of the opposition, and so the negative impact of an absence of a criminal justice system.